This is part two. Like I said, I kind of started going off the rails. Cindy had gone off to Italy. She didn't last 3 months before she had got all about me. Didn't ever hear from her anymore till a couple of years later when they rotated back to the States before I ever saw her or heard from her again. But 17, I'd kind of had my apple cart upset. Mom and Daddy's having marital problems. Daddy's having an affair. My girl done went off and left me, and she don't even acknowledge my existence. And long about that time, I discovered beer and got started drinking. It was in the evenings. I worked all the time. I never let it interfere with my working, but we were partying pretty hard, like a lot of teenagers. 70s dope was a big deal. I never got off into the dope. I was always too afraid of that stuff. I never even wanted anything to do with weed or any of that stuff. But I did like my beer, and there was a period there where I liked hard liquor. But anyway, kind of went off the rails, took up smoking. Went on to become a 3-pack-a-day smoker, and I could go through a box of Copenhagen in about 2 days along with my cigarettes. That was later on down the road, but it escalated to that point. So rolled along there. That was my junior year. My senior year of high school, Mom and Daddy had moved back to Dallas. They were still together, but just barely. They were going to try to get a fresh start in another town. So they moved back to Dallas, and I stayed in Big Spring. I started out moving in with a buddy and his mother. And I don't know, that was in June, 77. And sometime along, I don't know, September, I guess, maybe, Karen and I rented an apartment together. And as I said, Karen was my older sister. She and I rented an apartment together. And I was still working, going to school such as it was. They finally impeached me as the treasurer of the FFA because I wasn't showing up to school enough to sign checks. So I showed up one day and they told me that they had fired me as the treasurer of the FFA and put another kid in there named Toby Bryant. And I was never there to sign checks. And I asked the teacher that day, I said, well, how many days have I missed? And he said, well, Clay, he said, you missed 16 days out of the last 6 weeks. There's only 30 days in a 6-week period. He said, you missed more than half. I commenced studying on that, and I realized I was fixing to be a high school dropout for what was fixing to happen. So I went ahead and checked myself out of school. That was in November. I checked myself out of school, and I went to Dallas so I could finish high school. Wound up graduating to South Garland High School in 1978 like I was supposed to. And had a job. I had a job at a factory where I'd go to work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and work till midnight. And I despised that job with a passion. I'd always been a farm kid. That working in that factory environment just did not suit my personality at all. But did that till I got out of high school. A day or two after I graduated high school, I moved back to Big Spring. Got started running with the same people. And the buddy I moved in with, his name was Ralph. And this was in June of 78. In July of 78, Ralph shot and killed a boy. And of course that was a pretty serious thing. That's putting it mildly, I guess, kind of understating it. Anytime you shoot and kill somebody, it's a pretty serious thing. But it was big news in a small town. And so I hung on there for a while. We couldn't go to town because the law was telling us basically, y'all stay out of town. We don't want you here. Ralph was out on bail, and they didn't want him in town. They didn't want me in town because I was associated with him. So first part of September, okay, well, this just ain't working. So I moved on back to Dallas. Mama worked for a drywall company, and they put me to work in an apprenticeship program, and I've been doing that ever since. That was September 1978. Now, I don't guess I've missed a day of it since then. Problem with the working at the drywall company was our hours was 7 to 3:30. Well, I was used to working from before daylight till past dark. So in my mind, all of a sudden, I'm working about half as much, and I'm making 3 times as much money as I'd been making. So I got lots of money and lots of time, and that is not a good situation for a 19-year-old boy. So I was drinking a lot. I was drinking nearly every afternoon. I'd start drinking when I got off work, and I'd drink till time to go to bed. And like I said, I never let it interfere with my work, but I was drinking a lot, and I was running the roads. I didn't go to bars and honk tonk. I'd usually just drive around and drink. Things were not good at home. Mom and Dad was still having trouble. It was not a good situation. Had bad relationships with girls and women and whatnot. A few years later, in 1983, started dating this lady, and kind of a funny story the way we started. We'd been kind of flirting back and forth, but nothing had ever come of it. And I was driving a Jeep Scrambler in those days, and my Jeep caught on fire one day in the parking lot of her convenience store, and I'd gone in there to get a pack of cigarettes. And the Jeep was on fire. She come running out with a fire extinguisher and put it out. So I said, well, I guess I owe you dinner. And so we went out to dinner and wound up seeing each other and moving in together, which that was a bad thing. She had 2 kids, Michael and Michelle. And we got married about, 8, 9 months later, September 1984. I married this lady. Michelle just flat out hated me, and I can't say even now that I blame her a bit. She finally came around. It took a while, and I place a lot of value on the fact that she did come around. I can still remember the first night she came in there and kissed me goodnight and told me she loved me, because up until then she never was rude, but she was just barely civil. And for her to come in there that night and kiss me goodnight and tell me that she loved me, it was like, wow, that was earth-shaking for me. And because now I had these kiddos living under my roof, and I'm providing for them, I'm thinking of things like the examples that I'm setting, and so my drinking pretty much stopped. I won't say I became a teetotaler, that wouldn't be quite true either, but I quit drinking all the time. I'd have an occasional beer or something, but getting drunk was out of the question. And we rocked along like that for a little while. They were both the kids were involved in sports, and I had decided to start going to college at night. I knew I wasn't going to be able to hang sheetrock the rest of my life, and so I'd go to college at night. And most nights I'd go to college from 5 in the afternoon till 10 at night, and then Saturdays till lunch. And the marriage was a bad marriage. It never should have happened in the first place. It just shouldn't have, but it did. And it wasn't long before I found myself in a divorce court. And the day I adopted the kids, Michelle was 17 and Michael was 14, I remember right. That was 1988, so let's see, Michael would have been 12. Yeah, Michael would have been 12 and Michelle probably would have been 16. And we're sitting there in this family court. Well, family court's where they do adoptions and they also do divorces. And they cranking out divorce after divorce after divorce. That judge just gabbling divorce granted. They got to us and an adoption. He was so happy to have somebody in there for something besides a divorce. Wasn't long till I found myself back in his courtroom again. This time getting my own divorce. I never, ever, ever thought that would be something that happened to me, and it just blew up my world. It really caused me to crater. Started doing a lot of drinking again. Kids stayed with me for a while. As long as kids were with me, I'd behave myself. Kids went to their mamas, then that's where I'd go off the rails. That went on for a little while, and I decided I could never feel that way again. I just could not ever, I just wasn't man enough to do that a second time. So I went to work trying to figure out what my part in that divorce was. There wasn't anything I could do about her part and the things that she had done to lead us to a divorce court. But what I could do something about was my part of it. And I don't care what the situation is. If you're in a divorce court, there's two people at fault. It's not just one person. There's two people that have put you there. And so I set about trying to figure out what my part of that was. And I spent a year going to counseling, trying to work through all of that so that, Lord willing, I'd never be back in that situation again. And it was a tough road. You have to deal with some pretty ugly stuff. You have to look at some ugly stuff. You have to kind of figure some things out about yourself, and that's pretty doggone uncomfortable. It just is. There ain't no shortcuts around it. You just got to put on your big boy britches and walk through it, because there just ain't no other way to get through it. Skirting it ain't gonna get you there. So anyway, that was in 1989. Back up just a bit, just before the divorce. My daddy come down with cancer. I was sitting there when the doctor told me there wasn't nothing they could do for him. That was in October 1987. By March, we had lost him. The thing you got to understand about my daddy was, I was in his shadow. I just worshipped the ground he walked on. He'd thrown me for a loop. He disappointed me with the marriage thing, but the fact still was is I worshipped the ground that he walked on. And when I lost him, it was just, it just blew me out of the water. I was only 27 years old. I wasn't ready to be a man in the world without his daddy to back him up yet. But that's where I found myself. Just a few months later, I don't even think it was a year later, and I'm going through a divorce and trying to figure all that out, how this is going to work. How am I going to get through this? These were problems that I just didn't have any skill sets on how to deal with this stuff, and no role models to show me how. Well, shortly after the divorce, I'm sitting there pondering. Like I said, I've been going to this counseling stuff. I hadn't been in the church at that point in time in 15 years, maybe 13, something like that. It's been a lot of years. I hadn't even been to church for Christmas or an Easter service, much less just a regular old Sunday service. I'd kind of turned my back on all that because I'd gotten disappointed. That's about the end of this part. YouTube fixed that amount of time, so if y'all are interested, stay tuned for part 3.